Good evening. Welcome to another season of Science on Tap. I hope everybody had a great summer. Thanks to everybody who participated in our field trip 2 weeks ago. That was really a lot of fun, the field trip over at Kemp Natural Resources Station. And thanks again to Ron Eckstein and Tom Giroux for leading that. It was a lot of fun. So welcome to Science on Tap. My name is Susan Knight. I'm from the UW Trout Lake Station up the road a little bit. And Science on Tap is an example of the Wisconsin idea, the idea that the borders of the university are the borders of the state. And at Science on Tap, you won't get a lecture, but you'll get some great ideas and an opportunity to interact with some eminent scientists from around the state. Our partners in Science on Tap are UW Trout Lake Station, also Kemp Natural Resources Station, the Lakeland Badger chapter of the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and the Minocqua Public Library, and our hosts here, the Minocqua Brewing Company. So thanks to everybody who helps out. And we are sponsored financially by the Brittingham Fund on UW campus, so thanks to them as well. And just a reminder that there are 4 ways to watch. You can watch us right here like you are today, but if you can't come here in person, you can also, we have live streaming at the Minocqua Public Library as well, and so you can watch over there and visit with Mary Taylor. We also have live video streaming for anyone with a good enough internet connection. That's not everybody up here, but a few of us. So go to our website and say watch live, and you can see you can stream it from wherever you are. So if you're in Florida for the winter or whatever, you can still watch. And you can also watch our events later. We tape all of these, and we will put them up on our website, and we also create a 8 to 10 minute short version so you can get kind of the highlights. Those are fun as well. My sound is funny. Is it as good? Oh, is that better? Okay. All right. We'll try. I can kind of hear my echo, but that's all right. We have some exciting new technology people today. So, our next Science on Tap event will be November 7th, and our speaker will be Kathy Kramer. She has written a book, The Politics of Resentment, Rural Consciousness in Wisconsin. It's about politics in Wisconsin, and should be really great. So that's November 7th. How's the sound? Is it okay? Too loud. Picky, picky, picky. All right. Oh, I shouldn't have said that. Okay. Okay. All right. So before we get going tonight, I want to tell you about some upcoming events. You might have heard about Dan Egan's book, The Death and Life of the Great Lakes. I'm really sorry, I did not bring a copy. It's a fantastic book, The Death and Life of the Great Lakes. This book is described as a portrait of an ecological catastrophe happening right before our eyes, blending the epic story of the lakes with an examination of the perils they face and the ways we can restore and preserve them for generations to come. And our speaker tonight, Dr. Jake Vander Zanden, and his research on aquatic invasive species are prominently featured in the book as well. This book is UW-Madison's Go Big Read this year. And Go Big Read is a UW-Madison-wide campus event. It's like a big campus book discussion group. Everybody on campus gets the book, and they're designed to give the campus community an opportunity to share thoughts about one book, and this is their choice this year. And several of our local organizations, including some of our Science on Tap partners, have organized 3 opportunities up here to discuss this book. The first is tomorrow, so you better read fast. October 4th at Lac du Flambeau Tribal Natural Resources Building. The second event will be at Trout Lake Station on October 15th. And I should note that the posters about it say Trout Lake Station, and that is our UW Trout Lake Station. It's not the forestry headquarters for the DNR. So if you're concerned or have any questions about the location, it's on Highway N between M and 51. The third will be at the Minocqua Public Library on October 30th. And so anyway, those of you on our Science on Tap email list should have already received a notification about this. And if you want more information, I think the easiest way would be to go to the Minocqua Public Library website and see where all of those different events are. I thought it was a fabulous book, and I hope you all get a chance to read it because it was really wonderful, really exciting, very interesting book, and participate in some of the local discussions. We also have another event, not associated with me, but I'm advertising for the Oneida County Invasive Species Program. And I'm just going to read this here. She said, are you wondering if a plant in your garden is native, invasive, or beneficial to pollinators? Are you curious if the snails along your shoreline are harmful or invasive? Does your neighbor suspect they have garlic mustard or buckthorn in their woods? Are you wondering if the plant growing by your dock is Eurasian water milfoil? Well, wonder no longer. Bring your suspects to Invasive Species ID Day on Friday, October 5th from 11 to 1 at the Triggs parking lot in Rhinelander. The Invasive Species team from Oneida County Land and Water Conservation and Wisconsin Headwaters Partnership, that's known as WIP, will identify your suspects and provide guidance on the best methods for control, management, removal, and disposal. So once again, that's Friday, that's coming up in 2 days, October 5th from 11 to 1 at the Triggs Rhinelander parking lot. So sounds like a good opportunity. Okay, so now on to our tonight's presentation. Tonight we are privileged to have Dr. Vander Zanden, Director and Wayland Noland Distinguished Chair at the Center for Limnology at UW-Madison. Jake's a Wisconsin boy. Grew up right on Lake Winnebago in Neenah, Wisconsin. Jake's interest in natural sciences was piqued by countless hours fishing on Lake Winnebago, but wanting a new adventure, he headed to McGill University in Montreal, Canada, for his undergraduate degree and his PhD. Jake stumbled onto a job working for a professor and a graduate student studying fish and food webs, which he thought was really cool, and it's pretty much what he's still doing today. Jake is interested in the ecology, threats, and management of freshwater systems. Much of the current work in his lab examines the spread and the impacts of invasive species in lakes and streams. In other words, Jake and his students study how phenomenally successful humans have been in mucking up our natural aquatic resources, moving species around the globe. Jake's research involves untangling the stories, revealing the complications, and figuring out if there's some way to undo some of the damage. Jake has studied spiny water fleas, zebra mussels, which arrived within a couple years of each other in Lake Mendota, right outside his front door. He's also studied rusty crayfish, largely eliminating them from Sparkling Lake up the road. And he headed up an audacious project to mix Crystal Lake to drive out the rainbow smelt. Some of you may remember that, the jellies going up and down in Crystal Lake. Jake has tried to understand how to minimize the effects of invasive species by practicing smart prevention. And as I mentioned earlier, his research figured prominently in Dan Egan's Death and Life of the Great Lakes. But Jake is not only a tremendous and wide-ranging research program, he also has won many awards, including being named a Leopold Leadership Fellow and winning UW-Madison's Chancellor's Teaching Award. And he finds time for his family and to be in rock bands, where he plays the guitar. All right, so given that, here is your trivia question about Jake. Jake's been involved in writing and performing music for much of his life, including his undergrad and graduate student days in Canada. The pinnacle of Jake's musical accomplishments was writing and recording with his band a song to advertise what iconic Canadian product? A, Molson beer. B, the Canadiens hockey team. Or C, a famous local brand of poutine, which, if you don't know, is fresh French fries covered with cheese curds and topped with brown gravy. The beer, the Canadiens, or the poutine? Molson beer.
Somebody got it right.
Jake Vander Zanden. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Susan. That was a great introduction. One of the only ones I've ever had that mentioned my songwriting background. So,
or poutine, probably.
Thank you. Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay, great. Well, that was a great introduction, and I'm glad you touched on some of these issues relating to the Go Big Read and Dan Egan's book. I think I would echo what Susan has said about the value of that book. It's a phenomenally engaging read, and I have read that book 3 times. And I spend most of my time thinking about invasive species and these changes that are happening to our ecosystem. So I found that book was incredibly interesting and informative for me personally, just because it tells some of the stories in an incredibly compelling way. So there were some things that I knew, like, oh, they use this chemical to treat lamprey. And in that book, they tell the story, and they really dig into the people behind the science. So again, I would highly recommend it. Susan noted that we are remarkably successful at moving things around, and I think that is absolutely true. We love moving things around. When I was a kid, you mentioned I fished a lot as a kid, and I personally was responsible for moving things around. Like I would go catch some bass in a pond, and I'd bring them home in a bucket, and my mom would say I'd have to get rid of them, and so I dumped them in Lake Winnebago. And so I was doing things like that as a kid, and so I feel a little guilty for having moved things around. Probably nothing too dangerous or dramatic at that stage in my life. But we have been remarkably adept at moving things around the planet, sometimes intentionally. And I think that was really something more from the olden days when humans, resource managers, were dead set on intentionally moving something that we liked from one place to another. And it was just common practice for the DNR back 100 years ago to just be moving things around everywhere. Now, fortunately, the DNR isn't moving things around, and we've learned from many of the mistakes we've seen with introducing species into new environments. But what we've seen an upswing of is the accidental or unintentional introduction of species. And in many cases, these species are coming from far corners of the world and occupying our aquatic systems right here in Wisconsin. The death and life of the Great Lakes talks a lot about that in the Great Lakes context. And a really key thing, a key theme of that book was that the Great Lakes historically were incredibly isolated. You had no streams whereby a fish could swim into the Great Lakes from the outside. And you had Niagara Falls acting as a barrier so that fishes could not swim up into the Great Lakes system. So here you have this system, which is really itself a series of lakes and interconnected streams and lakes that drain into those lakes. So really the watershed we're talking about. And it was very isolated. And we proceeded to reduce or eliminate that isolation by building canals so that boats could move around and in and out of the Great Lakes. At that time, let's say in the 1800s, ships and boats and canals were the major way that people were moving goods and other people around from place to place. So without those canals, it took months to cross the central part of the U.S. They put in a canal, and it greatly accelerated trade and transport. So these canals came in, and people started moving things around, and invasive species followed as hitchhikers. The real icing on the cake here was the building of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway, which allowed large ocean-going vessels to move through the St. Lawrence River into the Great Lakes. And these large ocean-going vessels have what's called ballast water, which is water they take into tanks in order to stabilize the ship. And so these boats would take in ballast water from the Baltic Sea, cruise across the Atlantic Ocean. They would dock in Lake Huron, and they would release some of that ballast water from the Baltic Sea, and along with it, hundreds, if not thousands, of species from some other part of the world. So that is why we have species like round goby, zebra mussel, spiny waterfleet, and many, many, many other non-native species that have colonized the Great Lakes. Of course, there are other reasons why the species have gotten in, but that's really a major factor. Now, the Great Lakes have received a lot of attention. Dan Egan's book was all about the Great Lakes. And I don't want to underplay the importance of the Great Lakes in our broader natural resources issues. But let's just stop and think about the state of Wisconsin. Okay, and think about how much shoreline there is for Great Lakes in the state of Wisconsin. And if you add up all of the Wisconsin Great Lakes shoreline, we're talking about 1,300 kilometers of shoreline. 1,300 kilometers. I don't know how much that is in miles, but yeah, let's just go with that. All right, so that's a significant amount of shoreline. But if you take the state of Wisconsin and look at the amount of inland lake shoreline, all of the lakes in this region, so inland meaning not Great Lakes, and you add all of that up, and you're not including the golf course ponds and stuff like that, you're just considering the decent-sized lakes, it's about 51,000 kilometers. Okay, so when you think about it that way, the state of Wisconsin is just jam-packed with inland lake shoreline compared to Great Lakes shoreline. There may be more water in the Great Lakes than there is the inland lakes in the state of Wisconsin. But we perceive our aquatic resources really from the perspective of the shoreline. We don't sit here and say, oh, how much volume of water do you have? We talk about how much shoreline property. And so that's a pretty powerful perspective. And so the way I like to think about this is that invasive species have gotten into North America, and the Laurentian Great Lakes are like the foothold or the sort of the beachhead for these species getting in. And then, over time, these species are finding their way into these inland water resources, the lakes in this region. And in the grand scheme of things, there is a lot more potential for these species to do damage to our inland lakes here than there is in the Great Lakes, just because there's so much more shoreline habitat, and the inland lakes, in the end, are much more connected to humans and much more heavily used than the Great Lakes. So I don't mean to discredit the Great Lakes and their importance, but I mean the Great Lakes are really the starting point, and we've had these sort of secondary impacts when we start to look at our inland lakes. So a lot of the work that's happened at Trout Lake Station over the past several decades has focused on the important role that these invasive species have had in the ecology of lakes in this region. And this is work that I've been involved in, but there's been a lot of other people at UW-Madison and elsewhere who have been participating in this. And there's also been a lot of students who over the years have played a role in conducting this research and contributing to trying to develop some understanding of what's going on. So Trout Lake Station has been a really key place for a lot of this research. And what I wanted to talk about tonight was some of the surprises that we've stumbled upon over the last 20 years that I've been here working on some of these questions. And this highlights that in science, we often do find things that we didn't expect. If we knew how things worked, we wouldn't have to do science. Science really is about discovery and surprises and finding things and coming to grips with things that you didn't expect. And often, when you find them, you're really surprised, and sometimes you don't even believe it. And I would say in many cases with this research I'll talk about, you make some discovery, you look at the data, and you say, that can't be. Well, that's when it gets really exciting, because you're starting to change the way you think about the world. Okay, so I want to go through 4, 5, we'll see how much time I have, interesting surprises. All right, the first one was that invasive species are actually, and when I say invasive species, I mean in lakes, in inland waters, in Wisconsin and this sort of surrounding region. So some of these lessons may be applicable globally, and they may also apply in Uruguay or wherever else, but I'm going to be generalizing based on work we've done here. Okay, invasive species are far more widespread than we think. If we go look at the records of invasive species that's maintained by the GNR, and you take the 5 or 6 invasive species that we commonly focus on, like Eurasian water milfoil and zebra mussel, blah, blah, blah. And you say, how many lakes in Wisconsin contain a record of an invasive species? It ends up being that about 7% of the lakes in Wisconsin have an invasive. Okay. And so that's a commonly quoted number, and it just reflects, well, how many records do we have? How many lakes are out there? In Wisconsin, we have about 15,000 lakes. So, more than Minnesota. Yeah. So, but here's the thing. Now, imagine you have a field crew, you pull some students together, you go to a bunch of lakes in Vilas and Oneida County, or maybe all around the state, and you are going to sample these lakes and look really hard and see if you can find invasive species. Well, when we go out and do that, we find invasive species in about 75% of the lakes that we sample. So wait a minute. Well, the records say 7%. And when we go out and we sample lakes, we find them one or more in about 75%. So whoa, this is a really, really big difference. There's a couple things happening here. Well, one is that the invasive species that are out there are not all known and detected. And there are things out there that we don't see, and they're not in the records. But two is that when you go out and you do a survey, you are going to the larger lakes, you're going to the ones that have a boat launch, and you're sort of selectively going towards, you're sort of biased in terms of what lakes you sample. Because most lakes in Wisconsin are really small, and you tend not to go to these small little lakes that no one ever pays attention to. So when you use the power of statistics and do a weighting process, and you do the math, essentially what you come up with is that about 40% of the lakes in Wisconsin contain one or more species of invasives. So it's not 7%, it's not 75%, it's somewhere in the middle. And our best estimate from how invaded are the lakes of Wisconsin, it's about 40%. So that is something that I found, somewhat surprising when I sort of embarked on some of this research, because my sense was, yeah, it's probably about 7%, because that's the sort of the quote that you get a lot from the DNR. So we're way more invaded than we think we are, although it's not 75% either. All right, so item number 2 is a small one, and it stems from the first one. And item number 2 is that the remote, undeveloped lakes in Wisconsin generally don't have invasive species. This is something that we were sort of intrigued by because, people have often been saying, well, invasive species aren't moved around by people. They're moved around by ducks, and there are natural processes for these species to move around. And we thought, well, yeah, it's possible that ducks do move around, and you could imagine that there are natural processes that would allow invasive species to disperse into new waterways. So we had a survey, one of my graduate students about 6 years ago, Alex Slotska, was trying to get out to get some of these really remote, difficult-to-sample lakes. And I remember when he embarked on the survey, he gave me a phone call. He had my cell phone number. He called me and said, Jake, I'm trying to get to this lake. I can't get to it. What should I do? I said, perfect. That is the lake that we want for this study. We want lakes that are really hard to get to, because we need to figure out if invasive species are in these systems. So he was able to get into 11 lakes that were just really hard to get to. And in those 11 lakes, he found no evidence of any invasive species, despite the fact that he's really good at finding them and was using all sorts of different methods to sort of comb the environment for invasives. So could there be invasive species in these systems? Yes. It's possible that some remote systems do get them. But from what we know in Wisconsin right now, these remote systems are protected from the impacts of invasives. And it highlights the fact that humans are the major driver for this spread of these species. Of course, they can probably move around by the birds, but in the grand scheme of things, that's a really, really, really minor player in determining their spread. All right. Third surprising thing is that invasive species, when you go out and sample them across a wide number of lakes, in other words, let's say I have a crew and we go out and we sample 100 lakes. In the majority of those lakes, invasive species tend to be at low abundance. They're not actually at high densities. And it's a smaller number of those lakes where the invasive species is at higher densities, which is actually really surprising. And I sort of stumbled upon this by this study that we did where we collected rusty crayfish from about 50 different lakes, and I thought, oh, well, they're going to be abundant in all these lakes because rusty crayfish has these huge impacts. They're really abundant. And when I looked at their overall abundance as estimated through the catch rate, in most of the lakes, it was low. But there were a handful of lakes, maybe like 10 or 15%, where those abundances were really high. And then those lakes where the abundances were high were where they're having these really large impacts. So I found that really surprising. But we've done some further research that looked at this pattern much more generally and found that is generally the case, that these invasive species are only sometimes really abundant, and oftentimes they're there at low levels. Now that's a little bit scary because they're lying there at low levels and they could boom at some point in the future. But in those lakes where they're at low levels, chances are they're not having these really dramatic ecological effects that we think about when we ponder the issue of invasives. All right. So they're often at low densities, but we have also found that populations of invasive species can be triggered by environmental factors to undergo population increases. And a really good example of this was in Lake Mendota. In 2009, out of nowhere, spiny water flea populations boomed in the lake. Now, spiny water flea is a small crustacean that's from Eurasia. They swim around in the water column. They have this really long spine, which makes them not very tasty for fish. And they feed on some of the native crustaceans. So we'll talk about them next in item number 5. But they appeared out of nowhere in 2009, and they reached these ridiculously high densities. Densities higher than anywhere else recorded in the world ever. And so we were wondering, why did the species just appear out of nowhere and reach these incredibly high densities? And we thought, well, it's 2009. Someone must have introduced them into the lake earlier in 2009. And maybe a boater came over from Lake Michigan, because they're in Lake Michigan. Again, brought over in ballast water. A boater must have brought them over, and then their population established, and they took off. Okay, well, that's possible. And it's often really hard to know what happens in those periods of time before a population booms like that. What happens? It's very difficult to see. These populations might be at low abundances. Well, we looked into what was going on in 2009, and it ended up being that 2009 was actually a really cold summer, okay? And an uncharacteristically cold summer. We haven't had very many cold seasons in the last little while, but it was very cold, and it sort of clicked with myself and my graduate student, Jake Walsh, that, wow, that's kind of weird that they happen to boom in this year that happens to be a really cold year, because it's a cold water species. And we didn't think it would ever establish in Lake Mendota because it generally likes colder water. Well, we ended up starting to dig into this a little deeper. And it had never been found in the zooplankton sampling that we do in Madison. We sample these lakes regularly looking at the crustacean communities there, but we hadn't ever seen them. But what we decided to do was go back into archived samples. So when we go out and we do sampling, there are some jars that get collected, but they don't get counted. And so in going back and digging through those samples, we were able to find 2 individual spiny water fleas from previous years, before 2009. Okay. Which tells us that they were there before, and we just didn't know they were there. And when that happened, we thought, well, are there other ways we can go back in time? Are there any sorts of ecological time machines we can use? And it ends up being that there is. The sediment cores, the sediment retains a record of the history of a lake. So down at the bottom of the lake, every year, layers are laid down that represent time. So we went out to the middle of the lake. We took a sediment core from the bottom of Lake Mendota, and then we sliced through the layers, and we looked for the spines, the telltale spines of spiny water flea. And we found a handful of spines dating back to layers that were dated to 1994. So what this tells us is that that species was there for at least a decade at really low levels, and despite the fact that we're out there sampling the lake, we never saw evidence of the spiny water flea until 2009. The environmental conditions were just right so as to trigger the population to boom. And so that was sort of another revelation. And it sort of connects to the previous one, and like, all right, invasive species are not always abundant out there in the environment. In fact, they're often at low abundance, but sometimes environmental triggers, changes to the environment, disturbances, can cause something that's sitting latent to boom and take off like we saw in Lake Mendota. All right. So the 5th point I want to make, and my final point, is that invasive species impacts are highly variable from place to place, but they can be enormous. And the example that I'll use again is the spiny water flea in Lake Mendota. So I mentioned that they reach these incredibly high abundances. And the spiny water flea likes to feed on tiny crustaceans that swim around in the lake, particularly the species known as Daphnia. Now, Daphnia are a sort of inconsequential little crustacean. Very few people recognize that in many lakes they play an incredibly valuable role in that they eat algae and they do a really good job of clearing the water. So in many lakes that have algal overgrowth problems, Daphnia are helping to keep those algal blooms down. This was definitely the case in Lake Mendota, where you had really high densities of Daphnia in the system, and they were doing a great job keeping the algal blooms at bay. We really only knew what an amazing job they were doing when spiny water flea came in and wiped them out. Because what happened after this food web change happened, spiny water flea come in, wipe out Daphnia, was that the water clarity got way worse and the algal blooms came up. So we lost about 1 meter of clarity. If you know what a Secchi disk is, you probably know what a Secchi disk is. It's used for measuring water clarity. We lost about 1 meter of water clarity in Lake Mendota. And Lake Mendota is a eutrophic green lake. It didn't have that much to lose in the first place. So algal blooms got worse. The lake got way murkier. And that was all triggered by this invasive species that came in and disrupted the ecosystem. So we were thinking, wow, all right, it made this huge change. We lost all this water clarity. And we thought, well, how can we put this into terms that people might relate to and policymakers might wake up to and realize, hey, this is a big deal. So we thought, well, how could we put a dollar value on the 1 meter of water clarity that we lost in Lake Mendota? And our approach was to say, well, if we wanted to regain that meter of water clarity, what would we need to do? Well, we could reduce phosphorus loading. And so we calculated how much phosphorus loading we would need to reduce. And phosphorus comes from farms and agricultural landscapes, mostly in that area. And we said, how much phosphorus would we need to reduce in order to get back where we were before spiny water flea came in? And it ends up being that we would need to reduce phosphorus loading into Lake Mendota by about 70% just to get back to where we were before. And we know how much changes in land use practices and agriculture we would need to do in order to get there. And those practices would cost about $100 million. So in essence, if we take this sort of perspective and say, all right, well, I mean, we had this service that we are being provided by Daphnia. And now in order to reconstruct that service using things that we can do, like reducing phosphorus, it would cost us about $100 million. So essentially, it puts a price tag on that invasive species in Lake Mendota alone at approximately $100 million in terms of the losses of environmental services that we've gained. So it's just sort of an example of how we can kind of think about invasive species in creative ways. And it highlights the point that in some places, they can have huge impacts, while in other places, they don't. And many lakes up here, or several lakes up here in northern Wisconsin have had spiny water flea invasions. And I will guarantee you, you haven't had $100 million of impacts in these lakes. So they can still disrupt the ecosystem, but often the effects can be minimal, but then sometimes they can be huge. And a big sort of mystery is, how can we tease all of this apart and get an understanding for when we will have these big impacts and when we won't? So those are my sort of 5 interesting surprises and things that I thought I would share with you. I think a key point here, though, is that this is an ongoing driver, and it seems like every year there's a new invasive species coming onto the landscape. We're learning a lot about these species and what they do and how they spread, but there's still a tremendous amount to learn, and I have found it quite just fascinating to be surprised over and over again as we've done this research based out of Trout Lake Station and around the state.
What are Asian carp, and should we be concerned in Wisconsin about them?
All right, yeah. Asian carp refers to several species, and oftentimes people will just say Asian carp. They are something that I think we should be concerned about longer term, but in more localized areas. Maybe in this region, probably not the top of the priority list, but in the Wisconsin River, St. Croix River systems, we probably will eventually have Asian carp populations at higher abundances there. They have very specific spawning requirements. They need these large open rivers, and their eggs have to incubate during a certain amount of time. So it's possible that they could do okay in the Wisconsin River coming up here, but they'd have to pass a lot of dams, and I would guess that they're not a huge concern here. In the state of Wisconsin, and then in several tributaries of the Great Lakes, though, I'd anticipate that they will, again, be a concern. They're famous because when you're boating, particularly down in Illinois, they jump out of the water. They get scared by the sound of the boat motor, and they have these incredible jumping events. So if you've seen videos of jumping fish, those were Asian carp. So, yeah. Well, they in the river systems where they've invaded, they can absolutely dominate the productivity of the ecosystem. So in rivers in Illinois, historically, you had this diverse community of fishes, and there was a sort of an ecological balance from all the diversity. When Asian carp got in over the past couple of decades, Asian carp have just taken over, and they dominate the community and the biomass of the system. So now if you were to go out there and sample fish, all you get in some places is Asian carp, with very few exceptions. So they've really crowded out the native biodiversity. And they also jump out of the water, and so people get hurt while they're boating and so on. It's been very transformative. But lakes here in this region are not going to be vulnerable to these species.
Much more basic.
Mm-hmm.
Regarding your research,
Yeah.
based on where we're at now,
Yeah.
how do you measure, can you give us a sense for where we're at regarding the Eurasian water milfoil issue?
Okay, yeah.
Specifically, the reason I'm asking is because we are on a small lake in Arborvita, and really we never saw 99 acres.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have a flowage. We really never expected to have the Eurasian water milfoil problem that we've been experiencing over the last 4-5 years.
Okay.
It's gotten better of late, but I wanted to get your input.
Yeah, so this is a really large issue in the region. I am primarily an animal ecologist, but nevertheless, we've been drawn into these Eurasian water milfoil issues as well. It's probably the most challenging invasive species issue in this region, just because they've gotten into so many lakes, and in many of these lakes, again, not all, they've had some pretty dramatic ecological effects, in addition to inhibiting recreation and clogging up the surface of the lake. So it's a very challenging situation, and in a lot of ways more challenging than many of these other species, just because of, you want to try to do something to manage it, but the techniques that people use to manage it can also have ecological impacts, and so yeah, it's a difficult one. We have done some work recently trying to sort of get a handle on the ecological impacts. And they can have ecological impacts on the ecosystems, but I think people are probably more concerned about the kind of recreational and nuisance conditions. So with regard to your lake, it's hard to say what would be going on there, but I mean oftentimes if you think that the populations are at low levels and they haven't really boomed, it very well may be that trying just to maintain the overall health of the lake and trying not to have it undergoing major disturbances, manage the lake for a healthy lake for resilience, and it may be able to, prevent the types of things that can cause the population to boom. So that's the way we're trying to think about this problem now is, these species get the chance to move around a lot, and maybe if you can have a healthy lake, the population of the invasive won't take over and cause these kind of horrible overgrowth problems. They're in a lot of lakes, so.
We've had an invasion of the Chinese mystery snail, and what can be done about it?
Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, in so many of these examples, it's very difficult to do something concrete about the species once it's already there. So if you already have Chinese mystery snail, there isn't as much you can do. If you're in lakes that don't have these species, then what you can do is work hard to try to keep species from getting in there in the first place. If you know that Chinese mystery snail is there, chances are they're probably at higher densities. So are they all over the place? Yeah, okay, yeah, so you're one of those. Again, it's difficult to, you're the tail of the distribution. It's difficult to do anything concrete other than, again, try to work on a healthy ecosystem and, make sure that you don't have a lot of nutrient pollution coming into the lake and a lot of ecological disturbances. But yeah, once they're there, it can be really difficult. We've experimented a lot with ways of getting rid of invasive species. I think that if we were to put the time and energy and money into coming up with ways of getting rid of the species, we probably could come up with it. Scientists, when they put their time and energy into things, can often figure things out. So there could be some way of disrupting the reproductive biology of Chinese mystery snail and adding some chemical that makes it so that the reproductive connections between males and females is disturbed. There are things like that could be done, but we're really nowhere near having the technology to do that in situations like this. So, yeah.
You talk about a healthy lake. What are the main things that you need to do to keep your lake healthy?
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, I think there are several aspects of that. One is ensuring that there is sort of a complex natural habitat. So that would involve there being aquatic plants and coarse woody habitat for the sort of range of species that are there. I would say trying to have intact shorelines where you have natural vegetation along the shoreline, making sure that you don't have a lot of pollution coming into the lake. That could be road salt coming in from a nearby road, or it could be nutrients that would be coming in from a fertilized lawn. I just think of the lake as the natural ecosystem and try to stay as close to that natural ecosystem state as you can, and that would be, I think, the best way to think about it. And there's a lot of efforts now to try to protect the natural character of lakes and maybe not have them be dominated by lawns and so on.
I was wondering if you could talk about the survey methods a little bit. You mentioned water samples and core samples. I'm wondering what other methods?
So survey methods for invasives or for other things?
For invasives. When you go to a new lake and you survey to see what species are there.
Okay, yeah. We will often deploy a range of methods. So for sampling in the sort of looking for crayfish, we would use crayfish traps and we would do visual surveys. We do both quadrat surveys, where we would throw down a quadrat and look what's there, and then timed surveys, looking for snails and that sort of thing. So we have a series of techniques that we would deploy on a given lake for this. In the last few years, we've moved more towards using environmental DNA. And this is a new technology that my lab and other researchers are using. And essentially what you do is you get a water sample from the lake, not in a beer glass, but in a fancier looking beer glass. And then we take it back to the lab, and we do sequencing to look for the signature DNA of the species that we're looking for. And we can go through now and get a water sample and come up with a list of the species that are in the water. And the reason why that works is because, let's say we want to characterize what fish are in a lake. We no longer have to go out and actually physically catch those fish in nets. The thing about fish is that they're shedding off DNA all the time, and so it's floating around in the water. We normally don't think of water as having a lot of DNA floating around in it, but in our lakes, there is that DNA floating around. And we can find parts of the genome that are specific to a certain species. So we hone into those parts of the genome, we sequence it, and we can get a list of what species are there, and we're starting to develop methods to get at the relative abundance of those fishes as well. So that's really the way of the future. And it is a much more powerful technique for detecting what species are there. And we think that it will allow us to start to get at those things that we don't see when we go out with a net. There are those species that are at low abundances, and the hope is that eDNA lets us detect them more effectively. So, because going out there with nets and all these different types of equipment is not that efficient. So, yeah.
I was hoping that maybe you could talk about how, as a riparian owner, how we can help our lake obtain maybe a snapshot of our lake's health and look for any potential hazards or new invasive species, what might trigger a red flag, and citizens lake monitoring programs, how that can help with monitoring for invasive species.
Yeah, okay. Well, there's a few parts to that question. As a riparian owner, I think there's a lot of responsibility, but also a lot of opportunities to do things positive for the lake. Being involved with your lake association is sort of a good way. And then there are various practices that, on your land that you can undertake, which I mentioned before, like having an intact natural shoreline, protecting fish habitat, sometimes adding fish habitat. And there are various state programs that we talked about today that will support efforts for riparian landowners to make those sorts of improvements. So I think the DNR would be a good person to talk to, or perhaps the county. Is the county or the DNR the best contact? Both. Okay. Yeah. The county or the DNR. Yeah. And the DNR. But I think, again, healthy lakes sort of ties into being robust against invasions as well. Again, once they're there, it can be pretty challenging to eliminate them. And you could put a lot of money into some program aimed at harvesting some invasive species. I've seen a lot of examples of where you'll harvest some invasive species and you can reduce their abundance. It's a lot of work, but then when you stop harvesting, they pop back up again. On the other hand, there are examples where we have harvested invasive species and their populations have stayed down. And one really good example is Sparkling Lake, which is just off of Highway 51. In 2001, the year I came to UW-Madison, Trout Lake Station initiated a project aimed at trapping invasive rusty crayfish from that lake. And a tremendous amount of trapping effort went into this. Lots of students spent a lot of time out there pulling crayfish from the system. They brought the abundance of rusty crayfish down to the point of where they were still there. We never got rid of all of them, but we reduced the abundance of them by a factor of about 100. So it got to the point where you had to look really hard to find a rusty crayfish. After 7 or 8 years, we stopped the trapping, and we just let it go to see what happened. Rusty crayfish populations did not bounce back up. They stayed at those low levels. The native crayfish species, which we hadn't seen in many years, came back up. Didn't reach super high abundances, but it was there. And what happened in that system is that the native aquatic plants, the snails, and bluegill and pumpkin seed came back to the lake. So if you like those things, then it was a good thing. And those species, particularly the pumpkin seed and bluegill, feed on the young rusty crayfish. And so once they came up, they were able to keep the populations of rusty crayfish in check. And so now it's been 10 years since we stopped managing the system, and the system has been in this desired state. We were trying to kick it back to an aquatic plant, bluegill, panfish-dominated state, and it never slipped back to the rusty crayfish-dominated state, which was basically just kind of like no plants. So that's an example of how, if you do a manipulation to a system, sometimes it is stable. But we put a lot of work. We were developing ecosystem models of what would happen if we do these different things. So we put a lot of work into that project. So, yeah.
I have a question for you.
Huh?
Are there invasive species that are present in the broader Midwest region or perhaps elsewhere that haven't yet arrived here that you are concerned about?
Oh, yes.
What are they?
Okay. Red swamp crayfish is one that I'm concerned about. It appeared in 3 ponds in southeastern Wisconsin. When they first showed up in Wisconsin, DNR was right on it, and they drained 2 of the ponds. They filled in 2 of the ponds. Like literally, those ponds are not ponds anymore. And the 3rd one, they did a chemical treatment, and they, in combination with trapping, and they were able to eliminate that one. Red swamp crayfish, I think, have a really high potential to spread rapidly, have large impacts, and crowd out many other aquatic species. So that's one to look out for. They like warm water, so with climate warming, I mean, that's why we've had warmer years over the last couple decades. That's why they've been able to make it up into Wisconsin, combined with the fact that people are moving them around. So that's one that I'm worried about. It might be it gets so cold here in winter that they might get frozen out, but maybe 20, 30 years from now, it'll be okay. Southern Wisconsin is pretty vulnerable to those species. Other ones. Round goby is a species that invaded the Great Lakes. It has been moving up the tributary streams. So now all the streams that drain into Lake Michigan have round goby. And in some places, like in New York and Ontario, they have been showing up in inland lakes. And probably because some angler moved them there. They just show up. Often you don't know how they got there. They're just there. Lakes here, inland lakes here in Wisconsin would be pretty vulnerable. They have pretty nice habitat for round goby like rocky habitat. And round goby are incredibly aggressive and nasty, and they will often crowd out other fish species. And so they will often lead to sort of a monoculture. There's like nothing else there except round goby. So that's something to look out for as well, particularly in zebra mussel invaded lakes, because round goby and zebra mussel are both from the Caspian Sea. Back in the Caspian Sea, you have all these zebra mussels. Round goby do really well feeding on zebra mussels. So when zebra mussels established here in North America, and then round goby came later, round goby found their favorite food from back home, and so we'll definitely expect round goby to be showing up in lakes in Wisconsin, particularly those that have zebra mussels. Now up here, there's not a lot of risk of zebra mussel invasion in most lakes, and that's because your lakes, generally speaking, are low in calcium. And zebra mussels require high concentrations of calcium in the water to build their shell. So there are a few up here, but most lakes up here do not have enough calcium for zebra mussels. So that's one you don't need to worry about all that much, which is great. So, yeah.
Yeah, question online. Someone wrote in that we had a huge population of mystery snails on Carpenter Lake, that's over by Eagle River, 10 years ago, and they're gone now. And this person believes the bluegills ate all the larvae. What do you think about that idea?
It's quite possible. This whole idea of things undergoing dramatic changes over time is something we see again and again. I mean, the ecosystem and the environment is not stable. And I remember Carpenter Lake, I remember hearing about that years ago and seeing photographs of people with wheelbarrows full of the shells of the Chinese mystery snail. I mean, that lake, I heard a lot about that lake back in the day. And it's interesting now, here it is, there's maybe few or no Chinese mystery snails left. So, the environment is highly dynamic, and these things happen. They're often very difficult to explain. I mean, how could you really pinpoint that specific factor that caused a population to go from really high to really low? Without some detailed ecological study, it's hard to pin that down. But bluegill and pumpkin seed do feed on snails. And when we think of a Chinese mystery snail, we usually think of this large snail, right? But there's the baby version of it as well. They're not all large. There are babies. And so large abundances of pumpkin seed and bluegill could easily crop down and possibly even eliminate the whole generation of young Chinese mystery snails. So in response to your question, it could be that protecting populations of bluegill and pumpkin seed could push down populations of Chinese mystery snail. Now, in Carpenter Lake, maybe 5 years from now, Chinese mystery snail will be back up again. There's this myth that invasive species will undergo a boom-bust cycle. Like, when they get in, they become really abundant, and then their populations come back down to low levels. That does happen sometimes, but generally speaking, when we have data on invasive species over the long term, we see all sorts of different patterns depending on the lake or the species. Sometimes you will see them go up and then come down. Other times you see them go up and then come down and then come up again and then down again, and it often is just up and down. you know. So it's sort of hard to generalize about those things.
Any idea of what density of a species you'd need in a body of water to be able to detect it by DNA sampling?
It really depends on the species. If the species happens to shed a lot of DNA into the environment, like most fish are leaking off DNA quite a bit. They can be at relatively low densities, and we can detect them using eDNA. And so it's pretty low densities. We're testing some of that now. Certain species like crustaceans that have a carapace and aren't leaking off a lot of DNA can be more difficult to detect. So for example, we did some work on this with spiny water flea and found that nets and eDNA detected spiny water flea at the same densities. But for fish, some of the evidence out there from other researchers finds that it's easier to detect them with eDNA than it is with nets. So, yeah.
A comment and a question. I think that you were talking about the species rising and falling, their population densities. And I think sometimes that might be because there's a riparian owner who's going out there and being a champion of harvesting that particular invasive species, whether they're raking up the Chinese mystery snails or trapping the crayfish, and we just don't know about it. And they're just doing it on their own, and we're just not aware of that. And my question then is, what native species, native to North America, are invasive in Europe and Asia?
There's many of our species here are invasive elsewhere in the world. So we were talking earlier today about what species that are of U.S. origin are invasive in Japan. And channel catfish was one that came up, largemouth bass, and Shiro, what were the other ones that you mentioned? Channel catfish, largemouth bass, bluegill, yeah. So this is Shiro, who's a visiting researcher from Japan, and he's up here visiting Trout Lake. He's based in Madison now for the year, and he came up to Trout Lake with us, and so we were talking about all these species from here that are invasive in Japan. So they're dealing with the same issues, and anywhere you go around the world, you see the same thing. I was in China this last summer and saw largemouth bass and bluegill and all these species, not native to there, and they're there now. So people really like moving things around, no matter where you are. So yeah.
What's the research saying about all lake chemical treatments using 2,4-D to get rid of Eurasian water milfoil? Are there significant larger consequences? And attached to that, in talking with Susan earlier this summer, she was talking about some lakes having Eurasian milfoil present, but it's just staying very stable, and that there were some findings associated with why that may be the case. And I wondered if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, Eurasian water milfoil is one of these species that follows this pattern I mentioned earlier. Often, in many lakes, not all, they're at lower abundances and they're not having any major ecological impacts. Now, there are some lakes that, the ones that you hear about most often are the ones where they are abundant and having these impacts. Chemical treatment's not something that I'm an expert on. I'm not really a plant person. But I know that there is serious concern about ecological and health impacts from doing these whole lake chemical treatments. And it's something that people should proceed with extreme caution. The idea of just dumping a chemical into your lake is not something that you want to take lightly. And the other thing that's fairly well known is that the 2,4-D can have ecological impacts on other elements of the aquatic plant community. So generally speaking, the impacts of 2,4-D on the native aquatic plants are more dramatic and more harmful than the impacts of Eurasian water milfoil on the native aquatic plants. So if you wanted just to protect the native aquatic plant community, 2,4-D would not be the way to go, because 2,4-D is worse than Eurasian water milfoil. Now, of course, we don't treat lakes simply because of our concern for the native aquatic plants, but there are other factors at play as well. I think that in many of these lakes where you have low abundance of Eurasian water milfoil, it would be probably a pretty bad idea to do whole lake chemical treatments. And I'm not always sure what factors go into the decision, to do a whole lake chemical treatment either. It's not something that I've been involved in, but typically I think it relates to, concern about, the excessive growth and overgrowth and so on. But, I think the science is still playing out. And yeah, I'm not a, yeah, back there.
Well, kind of to backtrack on that.
Yeah.
Or as a landowner close to lakes, what could we do as far as like fertilizers, dishwashing detergent, things like that? I think it's phosphorus. What is it in those kinds of things that affect the lake, and what can we do about it?
Okay. Yeah, phosphorus is the probably the biggest concern with our lakes, sort of nationwide. It's a plant nutrient, and it's often used as a fertilizer. I don't want to generalize too much, because if you go buy a fertilizer, at least in Dane County, if you buy fertilizer at the local hardware store, that fertilizer has phosphorus banned from it. And so if you get fertilizer for your yard, it doesn't have phosphorus in it. Up here, if you buy fertilizer for your yard, it probably does have phosphorus in it. I'm not sure. I doubt if there's been a ban of phosphorus. But it is a plant nutrient. Farmers will put it on their fields because it fertilizes plants. Well, when you come to a lake, algae is also a plant. And algae require phosphorus. And so if we do anything that results in phosphorus making its way into a lake, we can see excessive plant growth, excessive algae growth. And so that's really one of the biggest concerns with the management of our lakes. Now, in the grand scheme of things, if we go to lakes in southern Wisconsin where we have farms, we have dairy operations with several thousand cows right near the lake, the amount of phosphorus pollution coming into the lakes down in the southern parts of the state are huge. Up here, we don't have major dairy operations, but nevertheless, even in a landscape like this, there are things that people do that results in phosphorus coming into the lakes, and that can cause this over-fertilization. And so you do have some lakes in the area where the lakes are really green, or water quality is nasty, or you get blue-green algae blooms. Blue-green algae blooms, like just green water, are a nuisance. They're unappealing. But the thing about blue-green algae blooms is that they're also toxic. And they can create toxins that can be damaging and even deadly to humans and pets. I say humans and pets because, okay, let's say there's a blue-green algae bloom happening in your lake. Okay, chances are you, as a resident, are not going to go down and drink the water because, wow, the water looks like green paint. I'm not going to go drink the water today. But your pets often don't realize that. And so that's really been the largest manifestation of these blue-green algae blooms, is people's pets dying as a consequence of this. And again, these blue-green algae blooms and then the poor water quality and algal blooms generally all stem from excess loading of phosphorus into the lakes. And that could come from fertilizer that you put in your yard, or like erosion of soil. Let's say you're driving around like on your property and you have ruts and then it rains and the sort of soil gets washed off into the lake. That's another thing that's bringing phosphorus into lakes. So, yeah.
The state of Wisconsin in 2017, the economic impact of tourism was $20.6 billion. Is the state of Wisconsin doing anything? And I'm going to guess that a large part of the tourism is lakes and trails and waterways. Is the state of Wisconsin doing anything to make sure we have healthy lakes to help their $20.6 billion of tourism? And this area relies on it.
Yeah. That is a really great comment, and I think the more we can argue for the value of our lakes in as many dimensions as we can, the better. I mean, they're not only part of our lifestyle, but they have this economic value, they have spiritual value, they're part of what makes us who we are here in Wisconsin as cheeseheads. So I think that's an argument that we can and need to make again and again. Now, to answer your question, there are certainly people who are doing a lot. There are the people who work for the DNR. There are private citizens. There are people who recognize the value of lakes and also make these economic arguments. I mean, the state of Wisconsin should be, I'm not saying the individuals who work for the state, but the state itself should be doing more to recognize the value of our lakes, the value of healthy lakes, and protect them as these jewels that are just so fundamentally important to what we have here. I mean, people come from around the world to experience our natural resources here. And for us just to sort of not, make effort to protect them, it boggles my mind in a lot of ways. And so we should all just try to keep making this argument about how valuable our resources are and figuring out better ways to protect them. We know a lot of the things that we need to do, and there are also new things that we can figure out to do it better in the future as well. Great question. Yeah.
I've always been curious about the effects of chemistry, the water chemistry, varying lakes around. For instance, we live way up in Winchester, right up in the northwest corner of Vilas County, and we're on a terminal moraine, so we have a totally different soil structure than other places. And our lakes, very fortunately, are really very clear. We have some invasives, but we have one lake that has an infestation of curly leaf pondweed, but it appears that it's been there for a long time and it grows with the other native plants, although we have controlled it now. But has there been a lot of study on the chemistry of lakes, what the lake waters, and how it affects or impacts invasive species?
Yeah. People do know quite a bit about, there's the chemistry and then there's the invasive species layer. But lakes in this region are tremendously variable from lake to lake with regard to their chemistry. And that chemistry could refer to the pH or the amount of dissolved organic material. The thing that makes lakes look brown like tea, you see some lakes that are tea-like, so that dissolved organic material, and including things like what types of dissolved minerals are in the lakes. So when you go from one lake to the next, they can be remarkably different in terms of the chemistry. And I made a reference earlier to calcium. Calcium is an example of an ion that has a really important importance for the biology. So the lakes that are primarily rainwater fed, the more like upland, highland, perched lakes, have lower concentrations of calcium. Some of those lakes have absolutely no clams or snails whatsoever, just because there's not enough calcium in the water to build them. But then as the water, much of the water in this region flows through the groundwater, and as water flows through the ground, it picks up these dissolved ions. And as we move from one lake to the next down through these ground watersheds, calcium concentrations increase. So you can go from a higher lake to a lower lake to a lower lake to a lower lake, and you see the concentrations of calcium increase. And you'll get then like snails and clams as you move to these lower lakes. And so there's been some pretty interesting research done that has found that these lakes differ quite a bit in chemistry. And then that chemistry can play an important role in determining whether invasive species can live there or not. So, as I mentioned, that's why many of these lakes do not support zebra mussels in this area. And even with crayfish, whether it be rusty crayfish or native crayfish, they require a certain amount of calcium in the water, about 2.5 milligrams per liter. Milligrams per liter. And if you're below that, then there's not enough calcium for crayfish of any type to survive. So yeah, the chemistry is a really important sort of layer to all of this. We've developed some tools for providing information about whether lakes are capable of supporting invasive species based on these types of characteristics. So for example, we have this online invasive species mapping tool, and we have basically classified lakes as to whether they're suitable or not suitable to various invasive species. So we have it for rainbow smelt, rusty crayfish, zebra mussel, and we're about to get Eurasian water milfoil on there, and also spiny water flea. And so you can go on there and you can see, oh, hey, basically it gets a map display, and you can see which lakes are environmentally suitable and which ones are not for specific invasives based on these environment things. Okay, you'll have to email me for that because I know it off the top of my head. Yeah. So, yeah.
Hi. Our talk so far this evening has been about research.
Yeah.
Has there been any collaboration with the business community, such as Eurasian milfoil being used as a marketable product, or possibly Asian carp fish fries?
Yes. I mean, how can we make hay while the sun shines? I mean, there have been a lot of really interesting creative attempts to kind of pull something good out of this. I know there's been some efforts to pair famous celebrity chefs with invasive species and try to get them to come up with these delicacies. And for sometimes it works. You know, I'm not sure Chinese mystery snail is going to be at the culinary top of the escargot. It's not so good. But I mean, red swamp crayfish can be a delicacy. So yeah, I mean, there has been some discussion with this, but there's probably more that can be done. And how can we take these things that we view as a nuisance and turn them into a resource? I think it'll take creativity. I usually look at the world through the lens of research, but if you're thinking about it through the lens of business, hey, maybe there's something there. So, yeah. There's a lot of invasive species out there, so hey, why not? So, yeah.
Hey, Jake. So speaking of other invasive species, there's one that hit Wisconsin lakes about 300 years ago or so. You might have heard of it. Homo sapiens.
Yeah.
300 some years, roughly,
Yeah.
I'm wondering what your definition of invasive species is, and whether the invasion of Europeans on the North American continent meets that definition, and whether we should eradicate that no, I think you get my point.
Yeah. I mean, humans crossed into North America about 10,000 years ago. Europeans came across, on the Mayflower 400 years ago. And so, we are an invasive species. And at some point, this whole idea of native or invasive becomes something of an arbitrary exercise. The fundamental reality of how we deal with this as an issue is that we don't pay much attention to the things that we are okay with. I'm not sitting here doing research studies on some species that everybody really likes and is from somewhere else, but we don't like. I mean, for example, cows. There's a lot. All of our livestock are primarily non-native, and we don't really ever consider them an environmental issue or an environmental challenge, other than the fact that they poop and it all runs into our lakes. But there is a somewhat subjective component to this. We often distinguish between non-native species and invasive species. Non-native species are species that are just somewhere else. I have Norway maple growing in my front yard, and at least in the city of Madison, it's not considered invasive. There might be places where Norway maple is spreading and crowding out other species. I don't know. But we just view it as a non-native, and we don't really think twice about it. Generally, invasives are the species that are both spreading against our will into the natural environment and having some sort of undesired consequence for people and ecosystems as interpreted through human eyes. Here's a really good example. Smallmouth bass and largemouth bass, they're species that are common throughout our part of the world. They're native here. If you go to the north edge of their geographic range up into Canada, both of those species are spreading into new systems. And so they generally view largemouth bass and smallmouth bass as invasive species in many parts of Canada because these new populations are popping up. they're spreading unintentionally and having some ecological impacts. But some people up there like fishing for bass. You can't blame them. And so there's this thing, well, yeah, some people like them and some don't. And you have sort of two camps up there. And there is that subjective component to it. Particularly, as we move north, we see species moving northwards because of climate change. Lakes in that region have warmed noticeably, and they didn't used to be warm enough for bass, and now they are. So how do we decide, where is the native range and what's not the native range when, these species might be just moving their range northwards as the climate warms? These are all really good questions. But fundamentally, what we can say is things like Eurasian water milfoil and zebra mussel are totally something we don't want, and we want to try to keep them from spreading around. And most people agree that it's like not a great thing to have them taking over our ecosystems. Yeah.
What happened when the zebra mussels came into Lake Mendota?
That's a great question. 2 years ago, students from my Limnology class were out doing some sampling along the shore, and they pulled up a piece of trash. There's like garbage, and there was one zebra mussel on this piece of rebar that they had pulled from the lake, and so they realized, or the TA who was running the class noticed that's not normal and suspected that it was a zebra mussel, and so that was fall of 2015. And by the summer of 2016, they were thick mats in Lake Mendota. And so we've been tracking the expansion of zebra mussels in Lake Mendota. They've colonized the downstream lakes. And what we've seen is, they always say that zebra mussels clear the water. What we've seen in the last 2 years has been a tremendous outpouring of blue-green algae blooms. We've had one blue-green algae bloom after another, and these blue-green algae blooms started right when zebra mussels invaded. So we feel that there's a connection between the two because nutrient loading and the other things that cause blue-green algae blooms didn't increase at that time. Nutrient loading has just been like this. And blue-green algae blooms have been through the roof. They've been causing horrible fish kills in the lakes. And we have had horrendous water quality problems in Lake Mendota following this zebra mussel invasion. So, again, just when you think you know what happens, zebra mussels generally do clear the water somewhat when they come into a lake. We've seen a reduction in water clarity and an increase in blue-green algae blooms. So, they tend to create environmental conditions that favor blue-green algae, and we've been trying to figure that out. And it seems like it's starting to make sense. We're piecing the puzzle together. So,
any other questions? I'll channel my inner Dick Lathrop.
Please.
Just throw it all in and see what happens. No, like make no effort one way or the other. Is that just a bad idea altogether?
I think we need to keep preventing things from getting into these environments. I think prevention efforts clearly do make a difference. You could just say, well, everything is going to have the chance to get everywhere eventually, and so let's just give up. Is that kind of what you're saying? Or that's what you're...
Or look at it more like an experiment, see what happens. What's the next equilibrium?
Yeah. Well, and when these things do happen, we do view it as an experiment scientifically, and we do see what happens. Okay, zebra mussels popped up in Lake Mendota in 2015, and now we're studying it, and we can learn some things from that. But, from the management side of things, I think we need to it really makes sense in terms of protecting our aquatic resources and recognizing the value of our natural beauty to just do everything we can to keep invasive species from taking over everything. But at the same time, there is hope. They're not always at really high abundances. Sometimes they can remain in ecological balance in ecosystems, and sometimes they don't. But it's not all doom and gloom.